All of the young adult and middle grade books that I'm going to talk to you about today have two things in common. One, I gave them 5 stars when I read them. And two, they have less than 10,000 ratings on Goodreads. Hello humans, it's just Martine, and it's time to talk about some criminally underrated books. Before I jump into the list, I just want to say that there are a couple of reasons why these particular books may have fewer ratings than I think that they deserve. The primary one being that they are young adult and middle grade books. Not a lot of people who read those age demographics and for whom those age demographics are written are going to be on Goodreads posting their reviews of books, and I totally understand that. I also understand that a large demographic of people who do use Goodreads, adults, are not going to be reading these books because they don't have interest in reading young adult and middle grade literature. Although I'm guessing that if you clicked on this video, that's not the case for you, so welcome to the party. I've always found reading YA and middle grade books to be extremely useful to me, not just because they're quick and enjoyable reads for me, but because of the value they show me in telling children about a variety of subjects and also looking at the minds of teenagers. For instance, some of these books cover some really heavy topics, but I think it's really beneficial for kids to have these models of how to deal with these topics in their lives, because they will come up. With that said, let's talk about 10 YA and middle grade books that I think are criminally underrated. We're going to start with My Family for the War, which is actually a translated work. It was first published in Germany, and it's about this girl who is put on a kinder transport from Berlin to England to escape the Nazi regime. So she's basically taken away from her family and sent to a place where they think she will be safe, but it also covers lots of different themes. So not only are we tackling some of the difficulties of World War II and the bleak look at Nazi Germany, but also we're grappling with what faith traditions look like for different people. If I'm remembering correctly, the main character of this is only Jewish by heritage, but is a practicing Catholic. Nevertheless, I think she gets transplanted with a Jewish family in England, and so she is suddenly thrust into a world where she sees a lot of faith practices that are unfamiliar to her. And watching her navigate those and think about how different traditions matter to her life is extremely touching, I think. And so not only is this a great look at what children went through during World War II, escaping from Nazi Germany, but it's also this great dialogue about religion and family traditions. Next up, we have The Beauty That Remains, which is this book about 3 different people. Each of them have very different lives, but they have one thing in common, and that is grief. They're all going through a lot of grief right now, and they're not all handling it the best, but one thing that does manage to tie the whole story together is the power of music and the power of other people. I originally read this book because one of the plot lines involves this girl who has lost her twin, and as a twin, I love reading stories about other twins and their emotions about being a twin, but the rest of this story hooked me in just the same, and all of it was extremely valuable. I think seeing how different types of people handle the same types of events, meaning big grief and losing people, is important for children. And for humans in general, emotions don't just look one way. Grief does not look one way. And so having multiple characters in the same story, all experiencing similar situations, but reacting totally differently, I think is really powerful. Next up, we kind of have a weird one to lighten the mood, and that is The Strange Fascinations of Noah Hypnotic, which I bought at the Dollar Tree on a whim one time because I thought it looked fun. And in fact, it was, because I gave it 5 stars. In this one, we're following this teen named Noah, and he's already quirky. Like, this reads a little pseudo John Green in my opinion, but then things get even quirkier when he gets hypnotized and he starts seeing all types of strange things. I just thought this was a really unique book, and it read like a lot of my favorite YA authors, so I enjoyed it. Like, I think when I reviewed it originally, I described the voice as a combination between John Green and Alice Oseman. And so this one was a really weird, out of left field pick for me that ended up being something that I couldn't put down. Next up, we have a book that's probably gotten fewer than 10,000 ratings because it's quite new. It came out earlier this year, and it's Ryan and Avery by David Levithan, which if you watch my mid-year freakout tag, you know has been my favorite book of the year so far. In this one, we're following 2 young men, Ryan and Avery, and the course of their relationship. We start on their 5th date, and we follow 2 timelines. First of all, we move forward from their 5th date and see what continues to happen with their relationship. We also move back in time to see their 4th, 3rd, 2nd, and then 1st dates and see how they met. I cannot overemphasize to you how beautiful the writing is in this book. I think it's a powerful story for a lot of queer teens to read, but more than anything, I think it's so beautifully written. Maybe one of the finest pieces of writing I've seen David Levithan put out into the world. And I've read quite a bit of David Levithan, but I wasn't sitting there going like, oh my gosh, this sounds like David Levithan. I was sitting there going, oh my gosh, this sounds beautiful. From the very first chapter, I was hooked. I fell in love with the characters. I fell in love with the words. It's a deeply emotional and meaningful story about these two young men who are trying to find their way in the world and find each other along the way. Next up, we have a little bit of another quirky one, which is Sanctuary. And this one I like to describe as Among Us with superpowers. The basic premise is that we're on this spaceship, but it's kind of a space jail. So we have the people who are like in charge, but then underneath there are people with superpowers who are being kept in confinement. And all of a sudden, bad things start happening, like in Among Us when you're going around on a little spaceship and then all of a sudden somebody is dead. I wouldn't say it was really scary, but it was a lot of fun. And I just think it never got enough hype when it was first published to get off the ground and get a ton of ratings, but I had such a good time reading it. Next up, we have You Asked for Perfect by Laura Silverman. Oof, this one hit me really hard. I even have a specific memory of where I was when I was reading some of this. I know that I was back home on a break from school when I was reading it, which is really important to how this book impacted me, because in this one we're following this young man and he feels the need to be perfect in everything. And we kind of see how his life spirals out of control when he tries to be perfect all the time. It's an exploration of perfectionism, the harms of perfectionism, the things that fear takes away from the joys of life. And also, we're just working with a pretty interesting cast of characters. I think for me, it was just a really good reminder of why being perfect is unnecessary and impossible. I think if I had had this book when I was growing up, I'm not saying that things would have been different for me, but I am saying I would have felt seen. And honestly, that's one of the most powerful things that I think literature can do for us. There are two powerful things I think literature can do. One, it can show us what it's like to be somebody who's totally different than us. But two, it can make us feel seen as we are and realize that we're not alone. For me, this book did that second thing. Next up, we have Too Bright to See, which is this really interesting middle grade story about this kid named Bug. Bug is going through kind of a lot, trying to figure out gender and where they fit in the world, and all of a sudden a haunted house comes into the picture, and specifically Bug starts to be haunted. I thought this book was really interesting for a number of reasons. The biggest reason being that I feel like a lot of books about gender identity are written for a young adult as opposed to a middle grade audience. I think a lot of people have the misconception that gender identity is something that comes about in the later teen years. But in actuality, children start forming their gender identities from the second they're born and the second that they can verbalize themselves and use language to describe their worlds. There have been numerous psychological studies that have followed preschoolers that identify as gender nonconforming, and I think it's valuable for kids who are already experiencing that feeling to see that they're not alone in it. I think a lot of people, when they ban books, have the misconception that books make people certain ways, but books meet us where we are. And I know that there are a lot of children who could use this book and have value in this book by knowing that how they are is okay and that they're not alone in it. Next up, we have What Happened to Rachel Riley, which is this middle grade book where this girl starts at a school and she's trying to figure out what happened to this girl who has kind of gone away. Overall, this is a book about how young women deal with harassment. It can be really heavy, but I do think it's approached in an age-appropriate way. In that sense, I think it's invaluable because these things are happening to young people everywhere. And again, a lot of them don't see themselves in literature, and that means that they don't have the tools to deal with their situations. I think this gives not only the assurance that you are not alone, but also some really practical tools about what to do if you're in this situation. I was really moved by hearing this story, and I was particularly moved when I sat there thinking about what this story could mean for lots of young people everywhere. Additionally, I just think it's a great story about everyday mysteries and the fact that things happen to people and we don't always understand why. On a slightly lighter note, my next recommendation is My Fair Lady by Brian D. Kennedy. This is a My Fair Lady retelling following these two boys, and one is like the star of his school's drama program, and one is really shy, doesn't really have any friends, and is forced to join an after-school activity, so he picks joining the tech crew, I think specifically the lighting crew, for this drama production. This more popular student then ends up taking this techie under his wing and kind of changing his life, and at the same time, they form a really deep connection with one another. Overall, I thought it was a really sweet book. I think it's also such a good portrait of how two very different people can have a lot in common. And as a theater kid myself, I loved all of the theater references, the fact that we focus a lot on what being backstage is like in the whole rehearsal process. Obviously, you have to give a shout out to the tech kids. Their vibe was immaculate. Overall, I just think this is a really fun one, especially if you enjoy theater. And last but not least, I recommend Answers in the Pages by David Levithan. I know what you're thinking. I already recommended a David Levithan. Do I really get another? But the answer is yes. Because there's one thing that I think a lot of these books have in common, and that's that most of them would probably be challenged or banned in some places, including the state that I'm in right now, Florida. If some adults in the state of Florida actually saw these books, they would move to ban them so fast. And that's another reason that I think that literature can be incredibly underrated, because it's actually being taken out of the hands of the people who are meant to read it. And Answers in the Pages is all about banning books. In fact, we're following this student who goes to this school, and his mom is the one that initiates a challenge on a book. And we kind of see what impact that has on the students. I think a lot of adults that initiate book challenges and book banning think that they are thinking about how it impacts children and how reading impacts children. But I think this book gives an interesting and important perspective on what it's actually like for a child when a book gets challenged or banned, especially when they're in the middle of the situation. No spoilers for what happens, but there's even a scene in this where we get to see the discussion with the school board about banning the book in question. I wish more people would read this book. I know people who want to challenge and ban books probably never will for several reasons. The first of which being that there is content that I know people would want to ban in this book itself, because there are themes about the queer community. I mean, it's a David Levithan book. Like, what are you expecting? And I'm not sure that this book has the power to change people's minds, but I do think it was very comforting for me to read and know that as a person who's been affected by book banning and who lives in a state where book banning has run rampant, I'm not alone, and people see the madness, and action can make change in a positive direction. It's also just a great story in general. So while not all of these books would be banned or challenged, I feel like a lot of them would be in some time or place. And so I want to recommend them highly. They're already criminally underrated. I hope these books find their way into the hands of the people that need them. If you like this video, go ahead and give it a big thumbs up and comment down below your recommendations for criminally underrated middle grade and young adult books. And subscribe for more bookish and college lifestyle content. And until next time, bye humans, bye!